Anna Smith, a 26-year-old translator, boarded the night train to Seattle after a grueling meeting with clients, feeling the weight of stress slowly lift off her shoulders. In her compartment were three strangers. Lucas, a man in his 30s with refined manners who always tried to keep the conversation going. Emma, a young student who barely took her eyes off her notebook. And David, a gruff, discontented man who complained about everything around him. Darkness enveloped the train car, and soon Anna drifted off to sleep, her heart racing faster than usual. Suddenly, in the middle of the night, she was jolted awake by a scream. Emma, panicked and pale, burst out of the compartment, gasping for breath. She screamed that David had been murdered. Emma's words sliced through the silence of the car like a cold knife. Anna immediately sprang up from her bed, feeling a cold sweat gather on her back. She glanced at Lucas, who sat there with pursed lips and a bewildered expression. Could it be him? Could one of them be the killer? They were all in the same compartment, and such a horrific act couldn't go unnoticed. The conductor, hearing the commotion, rushed into the compartment, his face frozen in horror as he saw David's lifeless body. His stomach was ripped open, and his intestines spilled out onto the blanket, staining everything around. Anna covered her mouth with her hand, trying to stifle a scream, but fear began to take hold of her. How could this have happened? Who could commit such a murder in a room full of people while others were sleeping? The conductor collected his thoughts and attempted to calm everyone down, but panic had already taken over the train car. Lucas, looking uneasy, approached the door, trying to assess the situation. "We need to stay calm," he said, but his voice trembled. Anna pulled herself from her thoughts, surveying everyone. Emma was pale and shaking, while Lucas looked at them as if they were potential enemies. Then, that night, as the train raced through the darkness, Anna realized the killer was among them, and now they would all have to fight not only for survival, but for their own lives and the secrets that would never let them rest. Here's the translation in natural-sounding American English. The conductor gripped the knife in his hands as a heavy silence filled the train car. The compartment door was locked from the inside, which could only mean one thing: the killer was still among them. Panic began to rise like a slow wave, flooding each passenger's consciousness. Emma stared fearfully at David's body lying motionless on the floor, his pale skin contrasting with the red stain on his chest. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore and screamed, which sent everyone to their feet. Anna tightly grasped her shoulders, trying to calm her down, but her own hands were trembling. The conductor waved his hand sharply, drawing attention. "No one is leaving this car until we reach Seattle. There's a killer among us, and he won't get away." "But how did this happen?" Anna stammered, trying to understand. "If the doors were locked from the inside, someone must have done it while we were sleeping. But why didn't anyone hear anything?" Lucas, crouching beside David's body, carefully examined the bloody knife. He seemed thoughtful, even a bit detached, which felt odd in such a situation. "This is strange," he said, glancing at the other passengers. "One of you is lying." The conductor frowned. Someone wasn't asleep. His words sparked a wave of nervous whispers and sidelong glances. Anna turned sharply, noticing Emma standing by the door, nervously fidgeting with a strand of hair. Her lips trembled, and her eyes darted around in panic. I'm just scared," she whispered, but it seemed like she was hiding something more. Maybe he woke up and saw something he shouldn't have? Lucas suddenly interjected, raising the knife so the conductor could see the blade. It was smeared with fresh blood, but something about it puzzled Lucas. He ran his finger along the handle and examined his hands closely. No trace of fingerprints. "This is very cleanly done," he said thoughtfully. A cold fear coursed through Anna's body. Something about this situation was starting to defy logic. Someone was acting with calculated precision. Suddenly, the conductor recalled an important detail and went pale. He spun around to the passengers. "The knife was taken from our car's supply kit, but I checked the kitchen tonight. It disappeared before any of you went to bed." Anna looked at the others. Then someone must have planned this in advance. Emma stepped back, her face going even paler. "This is all a mistake," she cried out. But there was something strange about her reaction. Too sharp of a denial, like someone already on the verge of breaking. At that moment, a dull thud echoed from the opposite end of the car, as if something heavy had fallen. Everyone quickly turned to that direction. The door of the neighboring compartment suddenly creaked open slightly. Anna felt her heart leap to her throat. No one was supposed to be in that compartment. "Who's there?" the conductor asked, but there was no answer. Overcoming her fear, Anna cautiously approached and opened the door. She barely held back a scream. In the corner on the floor was a red stain, but there was no one there. Just a torn ticket with the name, David. Lucas stepped closer and silently picked up the ticket. "Then who was with us all night?" he whispered, a barely noticeable smirk on his face. The night enveloped the train, leaving the carriage in utter darkness. After David's horrific death, everyone felt fear creeping into every corner of their minds. The passengers tried to sleep, but the silence was unbearable. Anna lay in her seat, listening to the steady breathing of the others. But sleep was far away and unattainable. Deep down, she waited to hear something ominous again, and it didn't take long to arrive. Quiet footsteps outside the train car made her freeze. At first, she thought it might be her imagination, but the footsteps grew clearer. Anna carefully sat up, trying not to wake anyone. Her heart raced, and cold sweat beaded on her forehead. She silently opened the compartment door and stepped into the dark corridor. In the dim light, she saw a silhouette by the bathroom. It was Emma. The girl stood motionless, her shoulders trembling as if she were crying, but no sound could be heard. Anna approached, trying not to frighten her. "Emma?" she whispered, but the girl didn't respond. As Anna got closer, she saw that Emma was staring at the mirror. Written on its surface in red liquid were the words, "Soon it will be your turn." Emma turned to Anna, and pure horror reflected in her eyes. It's not me," she croaked, stammering. Her hands shook, and her gaze darted around as if she were trapped. Anna felt her legs buckle beneath her, and she silently stepped back. She didn't know what it meant, but every fiber of her being screamed danger. "Go back to the compartment," she whispered, gripping Emma's hand. But instead of turning back together, Anna suddenly ran, leaving the girl alone by the mirror. An irrational fear enveloped her. Something about this situation was worse than she could imagine. She buried herself under the blanket, trying to forget what she had seen, and fell asleep only for a few hours. When morning came, the carriage was filled with screams. Anna woke up to a horrifying voice piercing the space like a knife. She jumped up, and before her eyes unfolded a ghastly scene. The conductor, pale as a ghost, stood by the bathroom door, hand over his face as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Emma lay on the floor, her body split open from chest to stomach, intestines spilling out in a gruesome chaos. Her eyes were wide open, frozen in a final moment of terror. Next to her body lay a bloodied knife. On the bathroom wall, someone had left another message. "No one will leave here alive." Anna felt her stomach lurch, barely suppressing nausea. Lucas stood nearby, unemotionally examining the body. His calmness now seemed sinister. "This wasn't an accident," he murmured, as if talking to himself. "Someone knew exactly what they were doing." The conductor announced, "This is the second murder." He wiped sweat from his brow. Panic seized the carriage. One of the passengers, a man in a jacket, began accusing everyone indiscriminately. "It's you! You all conspired." Anna tried to distance herself from the chaos engulfing the carriage. She suddenly noticed something she hadn't seen before. Near Emma's hand lay a torn piece of fabric, black, as if it had been ripped from a jacket or coat. Anna remembered seeing the same material in the corridor last night, but not on Emma. Her gaze involuntarily slid to Lucas, who stood a bit aside in his dark jacket. The jacket looked intact, but something about his expression made her uneasy. He met her gaze and smiled faintly, but the smile was hollow, like someone who knew more than they were saying. "What are you looking at?" Lucas asked calmly, noticing Anna evaluating his clothing. "Nothing," she quickly replied, averting her eyes. Her heart raced again, and she didn't know if it was from fear or from the feeling that she had just made a terrible mistake. Meanwhile, the conductor was trying to regain control of the situation. He locked the bathroom and told the passengers to stay in their compartments. "No one will move until we figure out what's going on here," he stated firmly. Anna felt the carriage growing even tighter, the air heavier. She didn't know if Emma was the last victim, but she sensed that the real nightmare was yet to come. The night enveloped the train car in its embrace, filling it with cold and thick darkness. Passengers slept in their seats, but the air was charged with tension, as if the silence itself concealed something terrible. Somewhere in the distance, the rhythmic clatter of wheels on the tracks set the pace for the unfolding events in this confined space. Suddenly, soft footsteps echoed in the darkness. They moved cautiously through the car, like a shadow stalking its prey. The figure seemed to know exactly where it was headed. A knife glinted in the dim light of a night lamp, heavy, cold, its blade shining with the blood of a previous victim. Lucas stirred in his sleep, and suddenly his eyes shot wide open. For a moment, he locked eyes with the silhouette in the darkness, and a look of unspeakable fear crossed his face. "No, please," he whispered, retreating against the wall. His breath became ragged, and his voice trembled. You don't want to do this. Wake up, please." But the response was silence. The shadow took a step forward, and the gleaming blade slowly rose. Lucas reached out his hands in a desperate attempt to stop what was already inevitable. "Stop! Don't do it!" he shouted, his voice filling the car with a haunting echo. "You don't want to do this. Please, I beg you." But the knife fell mercilessly onto his body, tearing through flesh. Lucas's screams sliced through the night, but his words drowned in the sounds of the tracks, like the final gasps of the doomed. Darkness greedily consumed every drop of light and hope. Lucas thrashed about, his hands grasping the air in vain. His eyes filled with despair as his voice faded in helplessness. It wasn't supposed to end like this, and finally it was all over. Blood splattered against the walls of the compartment, and his body crumpled to the floor in a lifeless heap. The night swallowed the remnants of his life. Anna jolted awake, as if ripped from a nightmare. Her heart raced, and her pulse thundered in her ears. She lay on the upper bunk, drenched in cold sweat, trying to comprehend what was dream and what was reality. At that moment, she thought she had heard a scream. The corridor beyond the wall was silent, only the distant clatter of wheels on the tracks reminding her that the train continued its journey into the night. An uncomfortable silence settled in the compartment, and besides her and Lucas, there was no one else. Anna felt something strange, a tension, as if the air had grown thick and sticky. She began to descend from the upper bunk, cautiously feeling for the seats with her feet. The dim, cold light of the night lamp cast long, barely perceptible shadows on the walls. "Lucas?" she whispered softly, but there was no response. As her foot touched the floor, her fingers encountered something sticky. Anna stopped, a chill running down her spine. Her heart tightened in her chest, as if anticipating something unbearable. She carefully knelt down and ran her hand over the dark puddle on the floor. Her fingers were wet and sticky, blood. Gasping in panic, Anna shook her hand as if trying to rid herself of this horrific trace, and suddenly her gaze froze under the seat. In the dim light, she saw something terrifying. Lucas's body. He lay on his side, twisted and cut to pieces, as if someone had dismembered him with gruesome precision. His eyes were wide open, and his mouth was frozen in a silent scream. Blood flooded the floor, seeping into every crack of the compartment, and a nauseating metallic smell filled the air. Anna felt her throat tighten, and terror filled her chest. She took a few steps back but bumped into a seat and lost her balance. As she fell, she let out a loud, desperate scream that bounced off the walls of the compartment and shattered the silence like a knife. "No!" she screamed, covering her face with her hands. Her scream was so piercing that it awakened the entire car. The compartment doors burst open with a crash, and the conductor instantly peered in, flashlight in hand. "What happened?" he shouted, staring at Anna, who sat on the floor, engulfed in horror. His gaze fell on Lucas's body, and he froze for a moment. The flashlight trembled in his hand, the light bouncing off the walls of the compartment, creating an even greater sense of nightmare. "What is this?" the conductor whispered quietly, taking a step back. He stopped at the threshold, frozen in place when he saw Anna trembling on the floor. Her hands and clothes were completely stained with blood. "What have you done?" he whispered, staring at her in horror. Anna shook her head vehemently, her eyes wide with disbelief. "It wasn't me. I don't remember." Her voice cracked like that of a child who didn't understand what was happening. The conductor slowly stepped forward, never taking his eyes off her, as if she were a wild animal. No one came in. "The door was locked from the inside," he said quietly. Anna stared at Lucas's body, then back at her hands smeared with sticky blood. How did this happen? She couldn't piece together the fragments of memories that seemed to surface from the depths of her mind. This was a nightmare, but it felt all too real. The conductor cautiously exited the compartment, closing the door behind him, and immediately went to call the police. "Don't come out. Just stay there," he ordered, glancing around in fear. Anna was left alone with Lucas's corpse. An icy panic gripped her body. She trembled all over, clutching her knees with her hands. It felt like a dream, and if she closed her eyes, maybe it would all disappear. But every time she closed them, fragments of that night flooded back, like scenes from a horror movie. She saw herself getting out of her seat in the middle of the night, how her fingers slid over the knife lying among her belongings in the backpack, how she leaned over Lucas, who was sleeping on the lower bunk. His face twisted in confusion as he woke up and saw her. "No, stop. You don't want this," he pleaded, grabbing her wrist. But she kept slicing, mechanically, indifferently, like a puppet under some ghostly director's control. She saw the blood, heard the screams, but at that moment felt nothing, just emptiness. Then the memory of Emma returned. She recalled stepping out of the compartment when Emma went into the bathroom. Anna stood behind the door, listening to the rustling sounds coming from inside. Now, remembering, it felt as if Emma's voice echoing from within was actually her own voice begging for help. "Emma, it's going to be okay," she whispered. Even though she didn't know why anxiety gripped her, she reached for the doorknob, feeling her heart pound in her chest, then pressed the button to open it. She saw Emma standing there, fearfully staring into the mirror. The horrific message, "Your turn is coming," etched itself into her memory. And at that moment, something inside Anna broke. She grabbed the knife again, and now it felt as light as a feather. Emma turned, a scream escaping her lips, but it was too late. In an instant, the knife sliced through the air, and blood splattered across the mirror. Emma struggled to break free, but her hands got caught, and Anna couldn't stop until the blood began to flow from Emma, her body collapsing to the floor. The memory of David also surfaced. She recalled him laughing, sitting with friends in the compartment, something in his hand. He always knew how to make people laugh, but this time, laughter turned to rage when he realized what had happened. "Why? Why are you doing this?" His voice echoed in her head like a bell ringing into the heavens. She didn't know what to say. She just stood there as her knife hand lifted again. When she struck, he couldn't even scream. The blow was so sudden that it seemed he didn't even grasp what had occurred. His body fell to the floor, and once again, the horrifying river of red was too much. When she opened her eyes again, Lucas lay dead. Anna clutched her head in her hands, trying to convince herself it was just a dream. But reality returned with brutal clarity as heavy footsteps approached outside the door. Stopping in front of the compartment, the officers exchanged glances. The conductor silently nodded to them and stepped aside, indicating he wouldn't interfere any further. "Ma'am, step out of the compartment and raise your hands," came the command from the corridor. Anna didn't move. She was paralyzed by fear. Her body felt foreign, as if it wasn't her standing in a pool of blood, as if she were still asleep. The police burst into the compartment and quickly restrained her, putting handcuffs on her. They mumbled something about detainment pending investigation and suspected murder. But the words sounded distant, as if shrouded in fog. She didn't resist. She didn't even cry. Her gaze was vacant, and only one thought pulsed slowly in her mind. It was a dream. It wasn't me. Yet the blood on her hands and clothes told a different story. When they took her to the Seattle station, the interrogation began immediately. The room was quiet and cold, and the officer looked at her as if trying to see into her soul. "Do you remember what happened that night?" he asked, staring into her eyes. Anna closed her eyes again, and another horrific fragment flashed before her. She saw herself, her emotionless face, hands delivering strikes, and the knife cutting into Lucas's body. She sobbed, unable to stop. It wasn't hysteria. It was a cry from the depths of a soul that had just realized the terrible truth. She had killed him. She had done it with her own hands. But how? Why? During the interrogation, Anna began to recall more. She realized she had acted in a state of sleepwalking. She hadn't been in control that night. It was like a horrific nightmare that had consumed her consciousness. But the worst part was that the conductor had known about her disorder from previous trips, but it hadn't interfered with anyone and had been innocent. He hadn't warned anyone, hoping that this time Anna would sleep peacefully. He took a risk and lost. The girl sat in the cold cell, staring into the void. She was no longer herself. Now she was a monster hiding in the darkness of her mind. And that monster had finally awakened. Hit like, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments what you think of this story and what you'd like to read about next. And remember, inside each of us live our own monsters.